now. And yeah, so to kick things off, so thanks for joining us today, Chris. Chris is the founder of Umio and author and creator of Health Ecosystem Value Design, which is going to talk a little bit about today. And I'm the community builder at Systems Innovation. So today we will explore a couple of questions. The first is, how can we begin to rethink, redesign, and realize greater health and well-being? The second question is, how has COVID-19 changed our perspective on health and care, our perception, priorities, and practices? How do we, and how we act generally? I mean, we're all joining this on Zoom, and I know a lot of us are Zooming around a lot more these days, and that's something that's just become kind of the new normal. Can't believe I just said Zooming around. Sorry, that's not a good way of describing it. But anyway, and so I'm glad to say that Chris has been working on the first of these questions for the past 4 years, and it was following a somewhat, I guess we could say, disappointing outcome of a major year-long project on obesity, that Chris decided to abandon Umio's then health innovation method. And he decided to put the whole business on hold and spend all of his time reflecting on and finding answers to the question of how to rethink and address the deeper challenges in our health system today. At the time, he didn't really realize that he would still be doing this, doing so 4 years later, spending thousands of hours of his life and consuming weekends in the process. And so today, we're very lucky that Chris will try to encapsulate all of that thinking by introducing his framework, which he calls Health Ecosystem Value Design. And then we can open up out to a discussion of people's reflections and thoughts on some of the implications of this model. We can maybe particularly talk about this in the context of how and what COVID-19 is telling us about how to think and act differently. And so on that note, it's with a great honor to pass on to Chris Laura.
Well, thank you very much, Bowen. Yes, so I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully, I should know Zoom by now and how it works. 3 months of lockdown, 4, whatever it is, 5. So
yeah,
yes,
I can see the slides.
Great. All right, so thanks so much for inviting me. A pleasure to be here. The first sort of open space, first opportunity I've had to introduce my work to the systems innovation community virtually. I was in Barcelona with Joss. I can't remember when, the autumn before last, in the real days, or when we used to meet up and so on. All right, so what I want to do is, as I say, sort of give you an introduction and then open it out to discuss the implications of this perspective and the further sort of implications and consequences of what COVID is telling us. I've got some reflections on that. They're not comprehensive, but I think they may be sort of the key ones, and but they're really open for discussion, an open space discussion. All right, so we've already said that, what are the two questions? How can we begin to rethink, redesign, and realize greater health and well-being? And how is COVID-19 changing our perspective on health and care, how we see things, how we prioritize, and how we act? So what is the purpose of my work? I wanted to start with this model. I don't worry about absorbing all of this, because what I want to do is sort of build up the model and show the different elements, discuss the different elements and their relations. But essentially, my work is the study of the formation of experiences with health, illness, or disease as a sort of context around experience. And it's the formation of experience over duration, so it has a sort of temporal aspect arising from processes of relations. So I'm sure this is all familiar language of systems innovators, relations of encounters, events, and forces. And its purpose really is to facilitate then the design of novel possibilities, new propositions of any kind, whether health policy, programs, new platforms, products, services, and technologies as well, of course. And what I'm trying to do with it is to really widen our usual conception of health to include culture, politics, social, economic factors. And I'm trying to go way beyond disease, way beyond illness and care in this expansive sort of view. So arguably, you could even say maybe this is why it's taken me 4 years and is a never-ending project, is that this is concerned with understanding and improving the human condition more generally. And implicitly, what I'm doing is to take a sort of beyond empirical, beyond representational, beyond associationist and the causal sort of determinist view of health, and particularly disease, that science and our healthcare systems usually deploy in order to guide their practice and their priorities. So I'm going to describe the individual elements forming the model, building towards the complete framework, a copy of which you can download in a PDF from the Umio website. For this week, no registration required. Okay. Oh yeah, I forgot it moves. All right, so there's a lot of movement. I'm obsessed with movement in my thinking and so on, but there we go. So we start with sort of a first premise, and this says that our diverse experiences with health, illness, and disease are byproducts of our encounters, good or bad, with entities in the world. Now, although disease and ill health can sometimes be traced to our genetic imprint, our actual lived experience of health and disease predominantly arises from the mix of good and bad encounters that we have in our social, material, and natural world. And these span, identified 4 types. First, encounters with other people in our families, with friends, in our communities, and in social groups, and in the context of cultural norms, morals, expectations of behavior. And I call these social cultural encounters. Second, we have encounters in places and spaces, the natural and built environment, and with man-made and natural materials or objects such as foods, technologies, drugs, of course, as well as things like the technologies used for consuming media, social media in particular. So both of these on this sort of horizontal dimension are easier to observe by a third party. They're sort of external to our inner experience. We can observe people interacting with these kinds of entities. Then third, we have in the bottom here, interactions, encounters within the body as a result of its movement and with external objects such as the food we digest, the printer decides to go off, turn that off, and the air that we breathe. So I call these bodily motor encounters. And then lastly, our perception and cognition of these 3 domains of encounters, the knowledge we have of them, the ideas and meanings that we've formed, and their translation into action. And I call this perceptual cognitive domain, perceptual cognitive encounters or interactions. And both of these types of encounters on the vertical axis are sort of more internal to our inner experience, and therefore they're harder to observe by a third party. And together, the 4 domains of encounters, having differing presence, quality, frequency, and sometimes adversity, intersect and combine to form our unique subjectivities, our singular experiences in life and with health, illness, and disease. Such experiences are formed from what are called affects. Affects are temporal sensations, feeling states, impressions, and their intensities, their quality. These are the sort of the building blocks of experience, and they fuse to define a particular quality of experience, such as a sense of joy, of sadness, a sense of awe, a chronic sensation such as of pain, a sense of unwanted loneliness, of hopelessness, of fear, and so on. So that's the first underlying foundational premise building up this model, is a view of health experience. The second premise states that these encounters that shape our experiences with health and illness contain forces found in real, social, and other structures. In an ecosystem view, we identify that health and its experience are generated and modulated within this sort of complex weave of mainly invisible yet real underlying cultural, social, political, economic, spatial, natural forces. Forces that sort of flow up between, over, and through us. Forces that become embodied in our experiences over time. Forces that stick around and persist in families, in communities, in places, in geographies, and forces that can have a particular intensity in certain social and ethnic groups. Forces that can shape our life course and be reproduced across generations. And in this view then of these dynamics of ecosystems forming health experience, or the dynamics forming health experience, we see that different individuals, families, groups, communities, as well as places, have different capacities to affect these forces and also to be affected by them. Hence, as well as being those feeling states and sensations, affects are also capacities or powers of acting in relation to these forces and encounters, or what I call affective capacities. So the model then combined, I call this an assemblage model of embodied experience with health in life. It shows the formation of experiences with health over a duration arising from the dynamic relations of these forces, of those four domains of encounters and of affect, plus the dynamics of affective capacity, the capacity to be affected and the capacity to affect. All right, so that's sort of a bit of theory underpinning everything. This is a model you can actually view now as a Umio presentation. There's a link to it on the Umio website from the resources page. And if after I'm done speaking, I can add the link to the chat box so you can go straight to it. So this is of an ecosystem model of negative experience with chronic pain. So all my examples in this presentation and in the book are of chronic pain captured from our research in Northern Ireland, and before that in England and other parts of Europe over the past 3 years. And these screenshots that I'll show you next are from this Umio, so zooming in on this sort of model of an entire, an ecosystem model of a negative experience of chronic pain. So just to give you a feel for what we think of what these affects and other elements look like. So here we have individual affects forming a negative experience of pain, in the bodily motor affective domain. So we have things like stiffness, all the usual sort of medical, the bodily dimensions forming sensations of pain. Now, these are all the different ones. It's unlikely that an individual person, unless they're really unlucky, will experience all of these different bodily motor affects of pain. That is a serious situation that they are in. So you can read some of those. The idea is that, however, affects also arise forming experience in those other domains. So in the perceptual cognitive domain, we have affects such as a sense of a longing for the past, for a life lost, perhaps when they had to give up work, a sense of always waiting for something to happen when you're living with chronic pain, a sense of a loss of personal autonomy, independence, a sense of diminished free will. Of course, these are fundamental perceptual cognitive affects that are linked to the bodily motor affects of pain, of chronic pain that I've just showed you. But not always. And often these are exaggerated by experiences, encounters in the other horizontal domains. So here we have social cultural affects. And a number here are, for example, related to a sense of loss of connectedness in the world, a sense of isolation or withdrawal from social life, a loss of confidence when at work. And a lot of people talk to us about work and the role of employers in understanding pain and accommodating people living with pain more flexibly. I should say pain here is defined as having persistent pain over a period of 3 months, your continuous chronic pain, and of course over many, many years for many people. So the affects forming the real experience of chronic pain are generated in the social cultural domain, the attitudes of friends, the understanding or lack of family, of partners, of your experience of pain. And then lastly, we have these material spatial affects that arise as a consequence of bad encounters with material entities such as drugs, medications, with alcohols, with foods, but also in space, in the places and spaces that persons with pain try and navigate, the environments, the home, of course. There's a lot of material affects arising from the home not being adapted to support a person to live well to be comfortable to undertake the activities, the functional activities they wish to undertake around the home. So those are quick examples of the affects at the center forming experience with chronic pain. And then we have around these capacities, these affective capacities. So in the bodily motor domain of affective capacities, so the capacity to exercise when in pain, the capacity to avoid certain activities that may lead to pain later on and have a knock-on effect and create pain or flare-ups, they're called. Capacity to obtain the pain care support when needed. Capacity to undertake basic personal care, self-care. And there's more, then I'll just show you these perceptual cognitive, oh, it's gone too fast. The perceptual cognitive ones are really important. So how do people individually understand their pain? How do they form a memory of their pain experience? How do they develop a capacity to plan ahead, to foresight when the pain might happen? How do they build the resilience to overcome setbacks? So all these are perceptual cognitive capacities for learning to live well with pain that people kind of have to develop if they wish to live well with pain. And then the last on the outside are these sort of structures. So these are individual structures containing forces. And I won't go into details, like some 140 different forces in the model, each linked to a particular structure. And what we can do with the model, we can identify the relationship between particular structures in forming a certain set of affects leading to positive or negative experiences with pain. Right, I'll show you here the bodily motor structures and the forces within them, because within there you can see there's the structure of value. And value, located in the bodily motor domain, is often how we think about value when we think about health and healthcare. We think about moderating the body, intervening in the body, and we measure the success of that using outcomes. So value is located often exclusively in this sort of bodily motor affective domain. And that has certain consequences for then how we think about the other domains and the relative importance in forming a person's experience with pain, good or bad. Okay. So what I've done actually, I've kind of created that model, and I've lost my point on my page here. To be straight with you, the model is actually not really representing experiences with pain or any experience with health for that matter correctly at all. Whilst it shows all those discrete affects, capacities, forces, and structures forming a negative experience in that case, and that can arise outside and beyond the body, its main limitation, and this applies to most methods for understanding experience, is the way that it's separating all the different elements. When we separate out elements of experience in this way, as I've done in that model, inherently we introduce a sort of spatial and static model or representation of people's experience with health or disease in this case. We then try and measure these elements with various scorecards and outcome systems, like the ones shown here. But the problem is when we do this, we only really serve to abstract our understanding. We reduce our proximity to seeing actual, real or lived experience beyond the empirical, beyond the observable. And we substitute quality of experience with quantities of parts. We use language like more or less in pain, higher or lower, those kinds of words to describe our experience to others. And so for me, it seems ridiculous to say, for example, I am twice as depressed as I was yesterday. I'm not, by the way, I'm having a good day. Or that my pain is 3 times more today than it was on Sunday. We can't really look at intensities of experience in this sort of way of modeling as a spatial magnitude within the body. So instead, and the only way I can really represent this, going back to the model, we need to think of experience as something like this, as like a melody of several overlapping notes in a song, and as though we're musicians or abstract artists, not architects with a blueprint to understand experience. We need to see experience more, don't look at that too long, we'll get eyesight. We need to see problems. We need to see experience more as a continuous becoming flow, as an overlapping fusion, a sympathy, a symphony, a qualitative sort of dynamic synthesis of all those affects those affective capacities, forces, encounters, and structures. And then with this view also, we must shift our questions from a concern with what is the experience, which is often the concern of science and the empiricism, the way we look at the people's experiences with health or disease. We must be more concerned with a focus on what is the experience becoming or emerging, how, where, and why. And we must accompany those questions with a concern also for what should or can be done to create improved transition and sustain good experiences with health, disease, or illness. So the question then is, how do we do that? Well, for any given health experience context, we can identify two polar opposites of assemblages of experience formation, a positive and a negative. So on the left-hand side in the red, the slow-moving assemblage, we have an ill health assemblage that defines, this is a chronic pain work again, the worst experience quality. On the right, the faster moving, we have a desired, valued health assemblage that defines the most desired or subjectively valued experience. And on the left then is a model really of someone with a debilitating, chronic, socially isolating experience with chronic pain. The external forces on them are strongly negative. Real experience time, not the representative time in terms of hours, minutes, and seconds, their actual sort of psychic time has slowed down. The affects forming their experience are stuck, they're intense, they're confined. The person has become overcoded by their pain, and their effective capacity to address their experience is very limited. On the right, by contrast, we see someone who's able to live well with chronic pain. They still have their pain, but they're able to enjoy a degree of sustained freedom when living with pain. They have a well-developed affective capacity characterized by a greater intensity of joy in their encounters in the world. So the next thing we can do then is we can think about the distribution of those assemblages of experience, quality, and capacity between those 2 points of the most positive and the most negative. As I've discovered in my work in pain and also in obesity, with persons with spinal injury, bowel disease, and a host of other conditions, these assemblage transition states that sit between the poles are characterized by a particular affective capacity, as well as a sort of a line of becoming within the assemblage. Either a line of deterioration from an at risk to a chaotic state in the red on the right-hand side of the model, or a line of recovery from the chaotic state to a stable state of living well or complete recovery on the left-hand side. So with this model now, we can see that the goals of our interventions in an ecosystem defined by a particular health experience context are primarily to prevent decline of people's experience to the negative pole, and to move and sustain the experience, not just of individual people, but of families. We can look at this in terms of communities, we can look at it in terms of places, whole populations even. The goal is to move and sustain the experience towards the positive on the left-hand side. And as well as applying then to any chronic disease such as pain, this polar assemblage thinking, a positive and minus, applies to any health experience or condition context, as shown here, whether a mental illness such as depression, a chronic multi-disease state such as obesity or anorexia, a feeling state such as a sense of insecurity, loneliness, hopelessness, anxiety, oppression, as well as behavioral problems such as drug addiction and eating disorders. Now, a radical way to think, and here's the line of recovery and the different phase transitions. Now, a radical way to think here is that distinct assemblages of a certain character of experience are real. And by real, I mean that people, families, communities, places, social, ethnic groups are attracted or get pulled into a particular assemblage, leading to a certain pattern, persistence, and experience quality of health, disease, and illness over a duration, over a life course, and over generations even. And so what this view tells us is that particular affects forming experiences with health from encounters with entities, events, forces are virtual, by virtue, they exist in a virtual realm outside the individual person, outside of the human body. They're out there amongst the encounters and the different entities that we interact with. And so therefore certain communities, certain individuals, families and places are more predisposed to acquire more negative affects, negative qualities leading to negative experience with disease. And this explains why obesity, for example, arises and persists in poorer communities. It also explains why COVID-19 has had an unequal effect on lower income persons and Black and ethnic minority communities as well. And conversely, certain communities, certain families are attracted or get pulled into or acquire the more positive qualities of affect. So they avoid the negative experiences. This is a way of thinking about the virtual realm of affects forming experiences outside of the body, outside of the individual person. So for example, this is one of the halves of the templates that constitute the framework. In our work in Northern Ireland, this shows the proportion of experiences allocated to the phase states in the line of deterioration for persons living with chronic pain. So if you can see, there's a percentage there in the top right segment, 25%. We identified that approximately 25% of the 400,000 persons living with chronic pain in Northern Ireland are at risk of having a worsening experience. 20% are already worsening and 15% sit within that declined chaotic state. And on the opposite side, we have, for example, in the top left, 10% of persons are learned to live well, are in a stable, sustaining condition, having a positive experience, living well with their pain. So what this new view gives us then is a view of the dynamics of transition and states of dominant experiences with pain around capacities of affect, around the capacities to prevent a worsening state and the capacities to recover to a positive, more stable, sustaining state. So therefore, in an ecosystem framing of health, gone too far. All right. In an ecosystem framing of health, disease, therefore, the unit of inquiry of design and creativity is not sort of an aggregate of individual persons, their behavior, lifestyle choices and motives, as most public health looks at it, but rather this assemblage, these correlates of certain affects, events, capacities, encounters, and affectors, organizations, agents, individuals, other individuals, social groups, technologies, that affect directly or indirectly a person's experience, a community's experience with health, disease, or illness. So last few slides. In this reframing then, we can now work with a new definition of health. No longer is health regarded merely as the absence of disease or as a functional resource for living, as in the WHO, the World Health Organization definition. Rather, we can now define health as the powers of acting, or these affective capacities, powers of acting in the collective body of forces of life, where health is sort of an emergent adaptive process of experience and capacity formation formed from these differential relations of affects, forces, and encounters in places and over time. And with this definition, also our view of value fundamentally changes, the view of value in health and healthcare systems. One no longer focused on achieving improvements in functional outcomes of disease at lower cost, using rudimentary quality of life scores and some vague notion of well-being. Rather, we now have a more novel view of value of intervening in a health ecosystem as the positive generation, the positive modification of ecosystem capacities to produce and sustain unrealized affects of health and well-being beyond the baseline, above the norm. So as this chart shows, instead of the baseline being our goal, recovering people to a normal functioning baseline of health, we should be identifying that baseline and then exceeding it. So what does this all mean for COVID? Well, I think I identify 8 different learnings from COVID, and then this kind of fits into the framework and this logic, this philosophy, if you like, that I presented. First, it tells us that health is a co-creation. It's much wider than healthcare. COVID tells us that our experiences with health, illness and disease are byproducts of our collective ideas, our collective perceptions, and all our interactions and actions. And so it compels us to see now how our individual health is intertwined with these diverse, complex forces shaping the whole human condition and experience. And as such, then, health really is a transdisciplinary field of inquiry. Second, COVID has given us greater awareness of the health inequalities of particular groups of people, and especially in their capacities to affect and be affected by COVID-19. So we're now seeing how and where I think that empirical health sciences kind of struggle to see diversity in lived experience and in people's capacities. We neglected the persons most at risk, most affected in our original prescriptions for intervention with COVID-19, and in many cases we still are. I think third too, then, the systemic forces present in structures of health experience are becoming more visible. We can see the mechanisms driving our diverse experiences of COVID-19 across and within different countries. We can see, if you like, the biopolitics at play in many states' failings and fewer state successes at intervention in our lives as a result of COVID-19. I think too, there's having no workplace, no fixed routines as much to adhere to as we had in the past. Many of us have been able to forge perhaps a deeper connection to our more authentic self. This sort of self-awareness has helped us to reflect not only on our own experiences, our own priorities in life, if we're lucky to have that chance to reflect, but also in some cases develop a greater empathy for the poorer experience of other people. And so in short, I think COVID-19 has made many people better equipped to not only pursue their own health and values that define a good life, but also help others to become equipped to do so too. I think too, there's a greater sense of possibility and desire to act against those who act upon us and our health. In this respect, I think we can see a connection between the oppressive force of COVID-19 on lived experience and the liberating force and action of, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement. I see them as connected. They're both a product of the changing dynamics or an awareness of our experience in relation to others and the forces acting upon our experience. I think too, then, talking about the health system, we need to, before the pandemic, we were struggling with chronic disease and mental health illnesses. They were overwhelming our health systems. But to save lives, improve quality, and make our health system sustainable, I think we kind of have to slow down. I think we need to take more time to live with and understand real experiences with health. And therefore, I argue that the rapid sort of technological acceleration that we've seen, expedited by design thinking, sort of fail fast philosophy, is not the answer. It's just becoming a race to the bottom. Trying to scratch out more incremental value just by doing the same things is no longer going to work. We need to think differently and slow down. I think too, then we need to sort of practically to do that, a new set of tools, skills, and frameworks. That's where my stuff come in. And I argue that we're really then reaching the limits of this empiricist, representative, spatial material models of health, and particularly of disease, and especially of experiences of chronic disease. And so my framework is arguing for a shift, it supports a shift of 4 dimensions: a shift from the person to the ecosystem, from the body to experience, from illness to health, and from outcomes to capacities. So this is the U process that's described in the book. And these just are very small images of the templates that make up the flow of the whole framework. It's a U because it tried to affect a dive down below the observable, the empirical, what we can see about people's experiences and about their health, into the actual and deep into the real forces, mechanisms, structures forming experience, as I've described. And then a design up on the other side, when once we have that learning, once we're able to reflect, see these deeper forces, see the relations forming experience, a design up on the right-hand side. Okay. So finally, there's no better time to pursue an ecosystem reframing of health experience and health and disease. I'm going to say that. one that adopts a virtual, relational, interdependent, generative, more qualitative and capacity-based view of health as powers of acting in life. So that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for that, Chris. I'm just imagining a virtual clap.
Sorry, Dan.
Yeah, sorry. Did you had you finished, or did you have something else to share?
I was reading a script, so I just had so much to cover. I'd forget all the linkages of the arguments and so on. So I can actually send out the script if it would help people. There's a bit more to it than that I published previously. So some of this stuff is very brand new. So I'm very happy to send out the script to the group. So
yeah, okay. Yeah, I think that would be great. No, thanks for that. Thanks for that really interesting overview of this. I mean, it really is, I would say, quite a different perspective. I mean, one thing that I kind of took from it is that, you know, you mentioned about the reframing. It is very much kind of viewing it differently and questioning this kind of desire for these objective metrics that are kind of commensurable and comparable across people. You know, I'm, like you said, you know, I'm double as much pain is kind of, you know, almost it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And really breaking it down from the abstractions into kind of the elements of, you know, what actually is leading to this experience and the relationship between these and how they together kind of form this experience. And also that it's not static, that there's constant this kind of like dance that that can kind of lead to, you know, an increase or decrease, and that there's this constant movement as well.
That's right. Yeah, and the shift in acting is that away from a view of the body as the human body, the individual human body, and then we move out to the person, and we move out then to the virtual realm of affects forming experience, and the lens we're looking at is experience. That's the starting position. But
yeah, that's one thing I really liked about it. The putting experience right at the center is really interesting, and then that experience is a composite of different modules from those different factors. And yeah, and then it goes outwards, right? And the effectors, the capacities, the forces, and the structures. I mean, I picked up on lots of different things. Actually, I guess the one question I'd like to ask though is, how would you then go about, you know, introducing that into a healthcare system and then making changes and so forth? Is that my intuition was to think about the kind of structures and the forces that are influencing the capacities and then the experiences in the center, or how do you go about that?
Well, the process of developing the framework and the templates linked to the movement through understanding, in effect, to create knowledge of that experience, to first of all frame around a particular experience context, then sort of dive down to understand those poles of negative and positive experience. They sort of create your sort of stakes around what is good and what is the best and what is the worst you can achieve within a particular experience. And then we dive further into structures and forces, and then have the design up. But it's being deployed already. We're working, the examples in the book, or by the PDF, it's becoming a book in August, are from our work in chronic pain in Northern Ireland. So we were set the task in Northern Ireland of how can we substantively improve the experience of persons living with chronic pain. We have 30% of the population, 10% cost to GDP, and all these sort of bodily motor oriented approaches, you know, all good intentions and so on. A lot of people are left out of those. There's a whole lot of misperception. And therefore we have to understand the dynamics of the problem more deeply. And then when we've done that using the templates, we then begin to see more clearly. We begin to see these relations. For example, the relationship between how pain is perceived professionally compared to how pain is actually experienced by persons living with pain. That's just one dimension. There's all these other factors. And then from this, then we can begin to construct new paths, new trajectories for moving out of those dominant forces, for undoing. And a lot of the work does involve undoing pausing, so I say slow down, to go back, see why things are happening, and then challenge those and change them. Often you can only transition by self-reflection, ecosystem level reflection in this case, going back, undoing, to see clearly why certain things are arising, those relations of affect, and then from there design up to transition to change things. And so the model has multiple applications around a broad context of health systems transformation. The starting point is always around a context of experience. So another project is, how do we recover the experience of a place, in this case, a region, a tourist region that suffered from, like every tourist region, from COVID, a loss of tourist income. How do we create a sense of security, a perception of health, and then design a set of propositions, a whole approach to not only attract visitors back to that region, but create all the context for health, for security, for people's protection, for the delivery of a superior experience for the visitor after or as COVID begins to subside. So that's an application to a place context, a region, yeah, as opposed to an individual application as in persons living with chronic pain. So yeah, I've got other examples as well. But
yeah, Chris, thanks, great presentation. I really enjoyed that. An observation and a question.
sure.
Here in Canada, we have a conversation going on currently, and this is apropos because I was watching a discussion of it last evening on dealing with obesity. And the underlying thought is dealing with obesity is a lot more than just saying eat less, exercise.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Right? And so it's an apropos conversation going on here in Canada right now to all the things that you're talking about. But it does make me curious about the coordination of all of this, because in all the things that you're talking about, this requires a really multidisciplinary approach to healthcare. And so the coordination of this must be a huge challenge. How have you dealt with that coordination?
Well, there's a model in the framework, okay, that is a non-linear approach to affecting change. So identify all the different capabilities that underpin, broadly speaking, three domains of action and learning. And it's an action learning model. So we have the domains of seeing the problem, seeing the ecosystem and the forces. Often as we're seeing the ecosystem, we're already affecting it. So our interactions with persons having that experience are already generating affects, hopefully positive, when we are undertaking our research. And then there's the emerge domain, which is how do we accelerate? How do we focus on the things that are working? So my model is, it does not prescribe a single approach. It says that there are these three domains of action that you define and sort of put weight into over the course of a program. And then so what that means is that within each of those sort of meta capabilities or dynamic capabilities, I call them, you're then performing collaboration, you're performing different modes of engagement with the different actors at different times. And every approach is different. So for example, something like obesity, we have the same conversation here about the government just launched a weight attention loss program, you know, based on individual motivation, behavior, etc. And a lot of people piled in on that. The challenge is then, how do you get the system of forces to shift to and not rely just on a person's individual choices around their weight? What that means is then often everyone knows that's the problem. We're not addressing those deeper forces, but there's no framework. There's no how to do it. And my framework is kind of trying to be the how. And it comes first of all from a self-reflection, from awareness, seeing the whole ecosystem, understanding why aspects of the experience, negative aspects of the experience persist. And then with that, you're raising the visibility of this understanding of these deeper forces, etc., into the empirical domain in that U model. And from there, you can affect lead people towards changing their practices, design new practices, and so on. It is complex, but
it's a huge challenge.
It's a huge challenge, but the problem is we haven't had the means to tackle it. We know, I think, what the problem is. The whole systems innovation community talks about structures, the bottom of the iceberg and all of that, below the waterline. But there's no framework, and there's no set of capabilities. There's no understanding of the relation of the capabilities and actions that you need to undertake to affect that systemic level transition. And nor is there one single method. There's no one. Every mix of propositions is different for every engagement, depending on the context, depending on the culture of health, and so on. I should imagine that the challenge of doing so in the US would be much more difficult compared to in Canada. The underlying forces of industry,
the healthcare systems being so different.
Yeah.
Because the other application I was seeing with this is something like manic depression. Right?
Yeah.
I have a relative who is bipolar, manic depressive, and just watching her go like a pinball through the medical system, being bounced from one to the other, for an endocrinologist, and then over to a sociologist, and over to and it just, and often she gets conflicting information, and it doesn't seem to be any kind of a wholesome approach to stuff. And what I like, and obviously this framework elevates that to a much higher discussion, which I like very much.
I think the fact that we measure depression using the PHQ-9 and things like that, and we've done work in depression and studied it dynamically in this sort of transitional way. And now recently we've classified it to sort of low, moderate, severe, and then tagged a set of actions to each of those, as though suddenly you jump from moderate to severe, all that kind of thing. But fundamentally, it comes down to a flaw in the way we understand consciousness, the way we see experience. And without being too polemic and so on, we seem to be going more and more down to this reductionist view of mental health and linked to a reductionist view of mind, where we see the mind, obviously in the brain, it's a cranial-centric model of depression. Whereas my work says, no, depression is outside the body in these affects. The forces of envy, like the guys in Sheffield, they write about the sense of envy, of loss of self-esteem arising from inequality itself, was one of the main drivers of depression. So depression is a great example or the perfect example, like obesity, are symptoms of our forces of capital and value accumulation and the way that it's unequal. That sounds a bit Marxist.
I don't want to dominate the conversation here, but
no, that's fine.
I had a conversation with this person the other day, and she was telling me how she can no longer listen to music because when she listens to music, it triggers her emotions and that drives her into a depression.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean,
she's lost
music from we don't understand. So you can't say you're 3 times as depressed as yesterday. My depression is 11, and on Monday it was 7. It doesn't make sense. No. And that sort of glibly it sounds, but I think that there is a lot at the heart of the problem of this scientific approach to thinking of human experience.
I'll pass to anybody else who has questions or comments.
Okay. All right. Cheers. Thanks.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah. As I was saying in the chat, I think as it's not an excessively large group, if you have a question or comment, feel free just to unmute yourself and and we can discuss it there.
I'd like to make a comment. Mike Taylor from Maryland, United States. Hey,
hello,
Chris.
Mark. How are you doing?
Good to see you again. So while the diagrams that Chris has come up with are extensive and can look complicated, if you took the existing healthcare system, particularly in the United States, and tried to diagram it out, it would look extremely much more complicated and probably look like a game of pick up sticks versus something that looked holistic. So I think in terms of the implementation of this, I think a good way is to look for allies, and I think you already have some allies, at least on this side of the Atlantic, in some of the nursing groups.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think you will find allies in patient groups too.
Yeah, and that's the case in Northern Ireland, most certainly. The model in Northern Ireland that we studied was the social model of pain, and meeting with different representatives in community chronic pain support programs. And the quality of experience they have in those programs compared to what they get in a physiotherapy centralized unit, not all cases, there's a lot of great physiotherapy and everything, but what they're telling me is the pain is alleviated through things like laughter, through sharing, through dance, through the ongoing friendships, the new friendships that are developed, and so on. So there's a real social model around a lot of chronic diseases, and I think pain is a great one because it suffers in a way from all the flaws, the empirical flaws, or the shortcomings of the empirical model of medicine, because pain can't be observed, it's largely subjective. Pain throws up all of these opportunities as well that are born of a more social model, a more social interaction. And when I talked about affective capacities, in a way, that's where there's a lot of untapped affective capacity. So there's a lot of untapped empathy for persons who have recovered from or living well with pain, for those that are still in a chronic debilitating state. And you need to go through that experience sometimes to get what it's like to have that experience when you're in the negative state. So a real route to transitioning health systems is to tap into this unrealized empathy between those who have or are recovered and are living more positively with a particular disease or illness, and those who haven't. And that's what I mean. There are surplus, untapped sort of pools of capacity that are unrealized. And this model throws those up. And the chronic pain example, we're now developing a particular way to surface those even higher in a more accelerated fashion. There's a lot of opportunity in the social, not just a community model, i.e. local people coming together, but elevating that into a whole region or a whole nation. And then, so the patient groups one is a key one. The nursing ones are really interesting too. I know that you're interested in nursing. What is the role of nursing if we think in these terms of our capacity and affect? If nurses can develop an intuitive sense that allows them to deliver empathy and be even more empath and more caring with the community of persons that are living with disease or at risk of disease, then nurses can play that key role in understanding at an intuitive level capacities and the variance and the diversity of experience. And so that's why I think I'm speaking to nursing communities. They see the power of the model for them to escape the trappings and the stuck logic of the clinical model that they're perhaps that they've been working in to date.
Correct. Okay. It really puts a boundary around the practice. But the thing I want to point out is a lot of things you're talking about and the things that we're talking about in our theory committees is the difficulty with the softer aspects of some of the healing arts and caring, and how you cannot come with a specific measurement, and measurements are key to the system, because a specific measurement like a pain scale or something like that can then be tied to some kind of economic measurement. And yeah. In healthcare, again, on this side of the Atlantic, if you can't measure it, it's not of value. And if it doesn't have value, then it doesn't have economic value either.
No, but then you can, what I would argue, you can, instead of using outcomes, use outcomes, but use capacities. Measure the transition in capacity to live well. Measure at an ecosystem level, you can measure, say a pharmaceutical company's got a drug and it's targeting one endpoint. And the primary endpoint is measured in all their expensive clinical research studies to improve by 50% a certain clinical indicator. And then they can't get any payers to support that because the endpoint shift transition is not big enough. So they spent all that money on research. So the way you do is, okay, what capacities, what does that allow those persons to do differently? What can they, how are they being differently? What more can they do? And then you can aggregate that up across the ecosystem of persons with that particular affect, negative affect, bodily motor affect, to define your measure of value. And therefore your payer proposition is much more ecosystem oriented rather than clinical endpoint and outcome oriented. It's more capacity based than endpoint, single endpoint based. So, so that if you can transition pharma to think like that, then you start knocking over those deep structures of thinking about value that basically pharma holds and dominates over other forms of intervention. So the pain model is, as I showed with the value position at sort of 5 o'clock, is dominated by medication, by the value and the ethics of giving someone a drug. Because the rest of the system can't organize itself to actually support people to live well with pain. So the easy option, give them a drug. But that's not sustainable, and it's not sustainable with pharma, and it's not sustainable for our healthcare systems. So the more that we can bring up and realize and address those other factors in the whole ecosystem, the more pharma can move into that whole ecosystem, or other players can come into it and do it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be a huge gradual transition from where we are, and avoid the social decline that's arisen from opioid addiction and things like that in the States, due to the dominant pharma model and the practices that they've created with pharmaceutical companies, with pharmacies, etc. Better be careful what I say.
That was one interesting part of that I picked up on in what you're talking about, shifting from outcomes to capacities is really interesting, because it's a more general thing in systems change. A traditional approach, as you say, is to kind of measure outcomes. But the systems, if you come at it from a systems thinking approach, then actually you're trying to improve the vitality of the system. Really, that's how people talk about it, right? These are complex adaptive systems, and right. A good healthcare system or a good educational system is one that's vital and alive, right? Underneath it, and that's ultimately what we should be aiming for, rather than, as you say, specific, scores in tests in education or in healthcare, whatever the metrics are. So I think that's a good one. Talk about shifting from outcomes to capacities, but also another aspect is around alignment across the system. It's not just individual capacities, it's how aligned are those different capacities in the system towards kind of emergent higher level functions in the system also, no?
Yeah, and that's often a product of cognitive capacity of persons with experience or communities to be aware of those forces. So we could say the Black Lives Matter movement has arisen now and it's more powerful because there's a collective awareness of the forces being acted upon them to limit their experience and opportunities. And so at the community level, a social group level, when you get an awareness of capacities or an individual, then that's where change can motor, because you create more understanding for those different affectees, whether an individual, a place, community, social group, etc. And I changed the language deliberately to avoid being trapped in words like patient and even person, because I think these are then we fall back into existing ways of thinking. The more you can create cognitive awareness of these forces impinging on your experience, creating a negative limit on your opportunity or possibilities in life, your powers of acting, then I think that's where change can be born, can be originated out of that awareness. So again, in Northern Ireland, a lot of people don't have a cognitive awareness of their pain. They can't understand it, and often they can't understand it because they're given tools by the healthcare system or drugs or an expectation that their pain will be cured, so they don't even start thinking about living well with pain. So it's making that cognitive shift. That's key, to affecting or beginning to affect the means to change the system.
Great, thanks. And yeah, I'm aware of time. Were you able to stay for maybe a couple of minutes extra, or did you have a bit
I'm fine. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Yeah, Janine, I see you made a few comments in the chat. Is there a question that you wanted to ask?
them out there and you can decide where you want to go. So one was leveraging what Mike was talking about a little bit, about tying to the economic justification, because here in the US, if the payer doesn't agree, it's not happening right now. Sad but true. And I'm a family caregiver, and right now I'm negotiating between 2 payers and 5 providers, and it's driving me crazy. So I'm curious if you've explored the predictive capacity of the model. So if we're thinking as systems thinkers and modelers, and you can look at the capacities and the affects of the system and say, if we focus here, it actually will yield a better outcome there.
Yes.
So it's worth your time. So is there a predictive capacity? And then that's one dimension. Another dimension is just this idea of, I as a family caregiver, is there a usable layperson version of this? Because the health system is requiring me to act like a junior doctor, and I'm not one. So if a model like this could help me reason about things better, I would love that. Okay,
so ecosystem reasoning, so like a toolkit that you can use in practice when interacting with payers and getting resistance. Say, no, I've got this argument, you're not seeing it properly. That's a great idea. I'd love to do that. Yeah, that's really cool. But I think I kind of the challenge of payers and affective capacity, I think that's a key one, but it's the value is in effect the deepest structure of all. How we prioritize, how we think what's important, how we determine what's important is the deep-seated structure underpinning everything. So if we can start seeing value differently, then that flowers start to bloom from out of that. But I think the idea of a practical toolkit that can be used in an everyday interaction is a really good one. Unfortunately, US health system, and that's something I think the nursing community will be looking to develop from this work. So they have an innovation agenda, and I think COVID is accelerating the potential sort of leap or disruptive force that they can embrace, harness to affect real change in the system. So, yeah. Okay.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thanks, Chris. Thanks so much for taking the time to share your model with us today. And in terms of any links or anything else, if you could send them over, I'll be happy to share them on Slack, so that we can all have access to that as well. I've shared an invitation on the chat. Did you have any closing comments or anything you wanted to share just as a wrap up?
I've seen the comments of some like Josh said theory U, and I thought, oh no, not another U model. I think as far as I understand, Atul Sharma's U is sort of a theory of leadership and change. This model is actually linked to sort of critical realism, a way of getting beneath the empirical, and it's a learning model. It's not so much a leadership model as I understand it. There's not so much a model for change. The first side of the U is about learning, deep learning. It's about getting to a deeper understanding of what's going on. And in that sense, the model is all about getting truth into problems. It's about, first of all, defining the problem independent of what we think might be the solution. And we don't spend enough time, I said about slowing down, we don't spend enough time really understanding our problems. And my work the last 20 years has all been about that, various different methods. Get to the problem independent of what you think you might do with the solution, how you might address it. And so the U is effectively deep problem dive, and using this ecosystem framing. And I think that's where the slowing down needs to come in. If we don't stop, we're just going to add more and more complexity, more and more lose sight of the people's real experiences and what forms those experiences. And that's why I'm really keen to study that. So. I'll finish there.
Yeah, well, it just made me, I wanted to make that point, maybe think about space, creating a space. Like that's what I see the problem of the U as, where you're starting to create a space where you can start to question kind of fundamental structures. And obviously that relates to COVID, right? It's kind of like we have a pause or a certain space in our lives, and it's the potential to question fundamental things. And then maybe out of that to recreate something. Yeah.
I'm clearly not happy that COVID came along, but I did think a long time about, is it the right time to get this framework out? Because the world's going to be consumed by messages about health and public health in particular. But it just so happens, I think, that time for reflection and having the framework ready in May when it came out was very optimum timing. And so, you know, that's not to glory in that, that's to say, let's really engage with this pause and see what we can do differently after. Okay.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think, you know, we'll have to leave it there. But if people want to keep in touch with you, Chris, what would you say is the best medium to do so?
Well, come onto the website. There's a newsletter that I don't try and communicate out. I try to live to that spirit of slow, and my thinking takes the time, and I'm really busy. So, but you can register on the website. You get regular newsletters. There's loads of infographics on there, as well as the open PDF of the book currently. And just send me an email. I mean, I don't do this to hide it behind a wall. I do it to share it as much as I can. And my passion is to see things happening and be different, and for people to use it. So by all means, please get in touch. Tell me your problems and challenges. I can do pro bono webinars in organizations like this. Really happy for that. And the more conversations I have, the less sat in my office on my own I feel, and the more we start to do good things together. So,
yep. Okay, fantastic. Well, yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today, and you know, thanks Chris for your time. Very much appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks, you,
everyone.
Thanks everybody for joining. Have a great evening.
Cheers.
Stay safe.
Thanks.
All right. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.